Welcome to Mystery School Dropouts, the show where we explore the strange, the unknown, and the unexplained. Today we're lifting the veil on two of the most mysterious alleged military experiments in history, the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk project. Were these secret operations truly attempts at mind control, time travel, or something even more bizarre? Let's explore the theories and stories behind these controversial claims.
Welcome, everyone. Now, I have to say, this is quite a wormhole of a topic. It's extremely expansive. So bear with me. I'm going to do my best, and I'm sure these boys are going to do their best as well. We'll start with the Philadelphia experiment, as it is colloquially known. God, that word. So, in October 28th, 1943, people who were involved in this experiment claim that in the government's attempt to veil or make invisible a Navy battleship, their technology opened up a void in space-time and was transported in space and time to a different location, to the 80s, to be precise. And there are a couple discrepancies from what I've heard about where it actually ended up. Most people, the accepted theory is that it ended up in Norfolk, Virginia, which is obviously quite a bit away from Philadelphia. The ship then it disappeared for about 20 minutes. During that time, people in 43 who were witnessing this or claimed to have witnessed this said that the ship was invisible. There was like some sort of like haze around it at first, and then it was completely invisible. And then about 20 minutes later, it reappeared, and whence it reappeared, a lot of the crew of the ship were infused into the ship on like a molecular level. Their bodies were actually fused into the hull, and they talk about arms and torsos. Very strange stuff. And then everybody else, including the people who were fused, I imagine, seemed to be in a state of mania or insanity, obviously affected by whatever had just happened. That is basically the events that occurred, allegedly, at the Philadelphia experiment. Now, there are many different reports and many different stories from many different people about this. Some people who were on the ship, including one, Al Bielek, claims to have a first-hand view of all of the events because he was on the ship. He claims that he was born Ed Cameron, who was the actual person who was a part of the military and was a part of this experiment. When the ship disappeared, his story goes, he claimed to jump overboard once he noticed something had happened and ended up in Montauk in the 80s, swam ashore to a base in Montauk that we will get much more into later, met a familiar face who he knew from his original time in the 40s, Mr. John von Neumann, who many of the listeners may know of, a famous physicist and mathematician, who gave him a tour around this research facility and told him that he must go back in time and space to stop the experiment that was going on in Philadelphia at the time, in fear that if it were allowed to continue, the rip or distortion of space-time or whatever would continue to expand and eventually potentially engulf the Earth. So this guy, Al Bielek, who originally was named Ed Cameron, somehow goes back, smashes the device or disables the device, and stops the experiment. He claims that the government eventually, through means I'm not sure of or I don't remember, ended up somehow convincing him that he was a whole different person named Al Bielek, and somehow either transported him through time or through some sort of advanced age reversal process, allowed him to make it to the 80s and still be relatively young. At the age that he was in the 80s, he would have been far too young to be a part of the Philadelphia experiment. So there's some sort of gap in time there. Whether it's like a physical reversing of his age or some sort of time travel, I'm not really sure. And he ends up involved in what this experiment inevitably leads to, which is the Montauk Project. And before I let Mr. Chops get into the Montauk Project, I just wanted to mention that Al Bielek, aka Ed Cameron, claims that the government continued to do research in this field of time and space travel and teleportation and space-time manipulation, and developed extremely advanced technology in these fields. And we'll go into some more of his specific claims later, but I just want you to keep that in mind. Now, Mr. Chops, can you please segue us into the Montauk Project?
Yes. So that was a good summation of the Philadelphia experiment, and the Montauk Project is this dauntingly huge, seemingly all-encompassing, alleged secret series of experiments conducted by members of the government, members of the military, and defense contractor, private industry companies to essentially do a number of things. The experiments were very wide-ranging, but they wanted to, and allegedly did, control the emotions and thoughts and actions of other human beings. They allegedly were able to refine the methods of the Philadelphia experiment and systematically create rifts in time and be able to send people back into the past and into the future at specific points. They were able to refine this process allegedly over the course of several years in the late 70s. And they were also able to manifest physical objects using thoughts. They were also able to control the weather. This is a lot. I'm putting a lot out there right now, just to kind of like blurt it all out, and then hopefully we can like piece by piece, like kind of like chip away at this. So the Montauk Project came out of a combination of the Philadelphia experiment, which was also known as Project Rainbow, and the Phoenix Project. The Phoenix Project, according to Preston Nichols' book, The Montauk Project, was essentially a government program designed to attempt to control the weather. So, and this gets very strange. I confess I don't fully understand it, but according to Preston Nichols, and other people before him. This is apparently a pseudoscientific thing I didn't know about. Something called orgone energy. Are you boys familiar with this?
Yeah, I've heard the term.
Yeah.
Yes, I've heard it.
Yeah, I know we're all mystery school dropouts, but hopefully we studied a little bit and we learned about this. um, but orgone energy is this sort of esoteric life force energy that apparently exists everywhere in the universe. All living organisms give it off. It exists everywhere. And apparently, and forgive me, I don't understand how they allegedly came about this, but the government was able to, they were somehow able to figure out that by emitting certain, I believe they were electromagnetic waves at different lengths and at different amplitudes, they could somehow affect the orgone energy that exists in the atmosphere, and thus they were able to affect weather. They could start storms or stop storms, make it rain, stop raining, yada yada yada. So they were able to do all this again through the manipulation of orgone energy. So these experiments are going on. The Philadelphia experiment was a thing that happened, and these technologies kind of converged to what became known as the Montauk Project. And what they discovered, apparently, was through emitting waves and manipulating orgone energy. And I hope I have this right. If someone correct me, someone in the chat, if anyone's listening, correct me, or you boys correct me if you think I have this wrong in some way. But my understanding is that through the manipulation of the orgone energy, they discovered that they could also affect the general mood of people, their temperaments, their attitudes. So they decided to try to hone in on this, and they used psychics. They developed something called the Montauk chair. So they would take. There's a lot of metaphysical stuff in this book that's just talked about, and they just move right on. They, like in the book, Preston Nichols just broadly accepts the existence of metaphysical things like psychics. And so he claims that psychics were brought in, they developed this chair, the psychic would sit in the chair, there were all these transmitters and amplifiers and oscillators attached to this chair, and the psychic would go into like a hypnotic state where their consciousness would drift somewhere else, and a primal state from within would come forward, if I'm remembering this correctly. And through that, by like cutting off their waking consciousness and letting their inner existence come out through meditation, if they focused on a certain mood or feeling and then took that mood or feeling through the it sounds so ridiculous to say it all out loud, through this complex network of machinery and equipment, it was broadcast out to the general populace, and they could thereby affect how people thought. In other words, to kind of like sum it up very briefly, they have the person sit there, they're like, okay, we want to make people feel angry today. So concentrate on the sensation of anger. The psychic would do that in this weird hypnotic, like split state. And the machinery would aim the antennas in a certain direction, beam that out, and then, yes, go ahead. Oh, yes, that one. That antenna right there, right behind you. And so in this way, they were able to affect the general mood of people. They were able to refine it so that specific thought patterns could be implanted into people, effectively making people think what they wanted them to think, like explicitly, like specific, like sentences, paragraphs, like just stream of consciousness thoughts. And thereby they were also able to affect how people like what people did, actions. So they were effectively able to create what is the term, like a splinter cell, I guess you could say. They were literally allegedly able to control what people did.
Like a Manchurian candidate.
Exactly. That's the term I was looking for. Like a Manchurian candidate. Exactly. But it didn't stop there because, as Brandon mentioned earlier, the the Philadelphia experiment actually transported a ship through time and space. It was able to create a rift in space-time. So they took that technology and refined it. Also, should I pause here? Am I going too fast? I know this is a lot of ground I'm covering. Do we want to, before I get into the time travel aspect, do we want to like take a pause and talk a bit about the mind control aspect? There's just so much ground here to cover.
I just wanted to interject on one thing. So one of the things that I saw during my research, and I think it came directly from Preston Nichols, was that the Montauk project was a follow-up to the Philadelphia experiment, and a lot of that had to do with this state that Brandon talked about earlier, where the people on the ship were kind of in a manic state and were experiencing, psychological distress, that they wanted to find a way to fix these people to make them feel normal again. And that helped kind of spin out into the Montauk project for that reason.
Right. Preston Nichols in the book references several times something called a time reference that every living thing possesses, that apparently you have it at conception. It's how, I guess, on some esoteric level, your essence is in sync with the flow of space-time in the universe the moment you're conceived, and that when the crewmen on the USS Eldridge were shot out of space-time, they lost the synchronicity with their quote-unquote time reference, and thus a lot of them went insane, because apparently this is according to Preston Nichols, having a time reference is an essential aspect to being a functioning being. So if you go out of sync with that, it causes disorientation and sometimes insanity. So yes, thank you for bringing that up, Alex, because part of the Montauk project was to find a way to fix that problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to just add a couple things. So first, thank you for mentioning. I completely did not mention that the ship that was transported in the Philadelphia experiment was named the USS Eldridge. So in case anyone didn't make that connection from what you said, that is the case.
And Montauk is in New York, just for everybody listening as well. I don't think we've mentioned that.
Also, good looks. I also, just wanted to point out that the correlation in terms of like technological basis for all of this is the assertion from people like Bielik and Nichols that the technology is the manipulation and specific pulsing of electromagnetic radiation at certain frequencies, wavelengths, and pulses that interact with the underlying space-time of reality. So that kind of manipulation of this like physical aspect, or I guess it's a physical aspect of reality, is the underlying thread here, and the technology that everyone is asserting that the government possesses that allows them to accomplish these extreme feats.
Mm-hmm.
So, and also, this is, we'll get into it more later, but I just wanted to mention with Preston Nichols, this is why he, part of the reason he ended up working on the project is because he has an expertise in radio frequency manipulation, how that interacts with the human psyche, as you mentioned, Chops, with like understanding like the whole psychic thing. And he has a baseline understanding of the science here, that he's purporting is what all of this is based on. So yeah, just wanted to make those things clear.
Thank you for that summation, actually, because I've been finding it very overwhelming on how to encapsulate some of this. That's a really good like gist. But it's also worth, I think, backtracking a little bit. You made me think of it in like the origin of this. Preston Nichols, the man who is largely behind so many of these claims, who passed away, I believe, in 2018. Passed away pretty recently. He came out with this story, and he said that he was initially brainwashed in the sense that his memory was erased of any of these events happening, but that through some life circumstances, he began to recollect his part that he played in these experiments. He goes into detail on this in the book. I don't want to linger on it too long, but it essentially he catches wind back in the, I think in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, that the derelict Montauk Air Force Base in New York had a bunch of old equipment, engineering equipment, and he was a hobbyist. He loved collecting equipment, so he actually no. Let me rewind. I apologize. Let me rewind. I remember exactly what it is now. He was working for a defense contractor, and he was studying psychics. So this is the origin. I have it straight now. Sorry for anyone listening. He was studying psychics, and there was a certain time of day when all of the psychics, all of them, at the certain time of day, they were no longer able to do their metaphysical meditations. There was a certain like 2-hour period where they just felt out of sync, and he found it very peculiar that all of these psychics were like losing their abilities in this like narrow time frame, like consistently every day. So he had an antenna, and he was like, I wonder if it has something to do with some radio waves out here that are like interfering with their brain waves. So he gets an antenna, and he's able to isolate. At the same time of day every day, there was this certain frequency that was occurring. And he had a hunch. He was like, okay, maybe this frequency is somehow related to the interruption of these psychics' abilities. So he, using the antenna, was able to isolate roughly where it is. It was coming from the derelict Air Force Base in Montauk, New York. He gets there. It's in complete disarray. It looks like it's been abandoned, but there's all this old equipment there. And he's like, I'm a hobbyist. I really want to purchase some of this equipment. And as he's inspecting this equipment, he starts to get, I guess, what amounts to flashbacks. And he starts to realize that he himself had a part to play in whatever this was that he had just discovered. And it turns out he had a very central role to play. So all these memories start flooding back to him. He had been memory holed, I guess is a term you could use. But, being reunited with this old equipment, like, re-triggered his memory. And so that's where the meat of this whole conspiracy comes from, is from him alleging, I've remembered that I had a key role to play in this thing called the Montauk Project. Anyway, yes.
And what I think what he also said is that he actually encountered somebody at the base who remembered him.
He did. That's right. It was a homeless guy.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Who had worked there apparently.
Mm-hmm.
That's so correct. Yeah, that was another thing that kind of helped jog his memory of this.
Yeah, that's right.
Did he also claim that some people at the military contractor that he worked at remembered him from the project as well? Like, he was working at some like aircraft instruments laboratory or something like that, and people there, I think, or he claimed that people there actually recognized him, and he's like, what the hell's going on?
Yeah.
I don't know what you're talking about. So it seemed
It's
like maybe all these things converging were enough to wake him up. In a
yeah,
sense.
I'll be honest, I found it somewhat hard to follow his the logic of his of how he structured his book a bit at points. But I do recall reading that he discovered that he had a second office he wasn't aware of, and this was also this is all happening concurrently.
Mm-hmm.
So like he finds his old equipment, he sees a homeless guy, like his memory's getting jogged, and then he discovers like he has a second office in like the basement of where he was
Yes.
working.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so not to linger on it too much, but the point is that all of these memories finally flood back to him, and he realizes, oh, I had a pivotal role to play in these government experiments that the government has tried to hide from everyone. And so he's the whistleblower, and yes, they tried to do. Allegedly, they were successful in not only controlling the weather, controlling people's minds, moods, and actions, but also refining the initial Philadelphia experiment in opening rifts in space time and traveling to different places in the past and future. Another interesting side note before I forget about it. This conspiracy really has it all, boys. It really has it all. He also alleges that the the financing for the Montauk project was through Nazi gold.
I'd
He
heard this
claimed,
too.
yeah, he claimed that during the Second World War, the Allies had secured a literal treasure trove of Nazi gold. Which, when I think this book was published in the early '90s, he said that the melt value of all the gold amounted to about in 1990, adjusted for inflation, like 30 years ago, $200 billion worth of gold. Anyway, so the Allies had secured like this train load, a literal train load of Nazi gold, which was being transported somewhere in Western Europe safely in Allied territory. I was going through a tunnel. Apparently, there was a giant explosion, killed 51 GIs. The gold went missing. General Patton tried to find out like what happened, where the gold went, what happened to the GIs, like what the circumstances were. Was never able to come up with an explanation. And apparently, many years later, this Nazi gold reappears in financing the Montauk project.
And this is why that when you look if you try and follow the money trail of
Mm-hmm.
this, because of the large expenditure that would be required, theoretically there should be some evidence of some like dark money moving around somewhere, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
but this is part of his explanation for why that money is not traceable to the general public.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Let's see.
Yeah, do you
Yeah.
maybe want to go explain his story on how this project came to an end?
Yeah. So jumping forward a bit. And I know this is a big leap for anyone listening. There's a lot that we're talking about here, but
If there's anything else in between, because I have a shaky grasp of it as well. If there's anything else in between, feel free to cover that. But I just thought, we should definitely cover the story of the end.
right.
I think
So
before we do that, I wanted to mention something. There's
yeah.
a lot of different types of technology that are supposedly involved here. We're talking about time travel. We're talking
Mm-hmm.
about mind control. One of the interesting things too that I saw mentioned was the ability to actually summon objects and things.
Mm-hmm.
And we can get into this a little bit later, but supposedly at one point a monster dubbed the Montauk Monster was even summoned. And this may lead us into how the project actually ended as well. But it seemed like they were able to summon things like houses in the middle of a field, They were, anything that you could think of was actually able to be manifested into physical reality. So it's just one of the other technologies that they supposedly, were using this electromagnetic field manipulation for.
And from what I remember listening to Preston Nichols, he claims that there is a kind of spectrum for this, depending on how strong the person was able to mentally conjure the idea or image of these things. And it could range anywhere from it being some like just visual holographic kind of non-real thing to something that can actually interact with matter and it actually exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember him describing it. Sometimes if it was weak, it was like transparent, almost like a spirit,
Mm-hmm.
right? Mm-hmm. But then other times, yeah, like the actual physical thing would just manifest. Yeah. Oh, as if we haven't, as if it wasn't broad enough and all encompassing enough of a conspiracy. I must note that when talking about these different technologies that were allegedly being used, Preston Nichols makes several comments almost like hand wavy. He just throughout the book, there's like at least 2 or 3 times where he just casually mentions that a lot of these technologies may have come from different alien races. But what's so funny to me is he doesn't even like linger on the point. Like that would be such a massive revelation, right? If that were to be true, that some of these technologies were supplied by extraterrestrial and races. But there were a couple moments in the book where he was like, "Oh yeah, some of the technology for the crystals and the oscillators that were used to project the memories through the chair were given to us by like the Syrian alien race from the constellation Syria," and he just moves on. Like he just keeps. Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah. So just to add even more here, Nichols also claims that he was abducted when he was a child, by aliens. Specifically, I may be pronouncing this wrong. The Pleiadians. I'm not quite sure how to say it.
Yeah,
But
he
yeah,
does name drop a couple races of aliens, and
yeah,
I think
he
that was one of them.
Yeah, he claims that he was abducted by them, and that's where he got all of his intricate knowledge about radio systems and electromagnetic frequencies, was by being actually educated by this race of aliens. He also claims that when he was a child, he had cerebral palsy, and while he was abducted, he was supposed to be dead by 24, I think he said a doctor told him, but the aliens actually cured his cerebral palsy, and he no longer has that, he claims. He also claimed
Mhm.
that while interacting with some of the aliens during his alleged Montauk project experience, that they would look down on him specifically for his interactions, as a child with the Pleiadians. And he says that the aliens would actually call him a Pleiadian dog, which was, I guess, he wasn't quite sure what it meant, he says, but maybe a derogatory term towards him and his interactions with that specific race.
I would not want to insert myself into alien politics. That's just a recipe for disaster.
We're gonna
I don't
get
know what he was
canceled, boys.
thinking.
Yeah, so if it hasn't been made clear to anyone listening, this is an extremely broad. It's almost like an umbrella of conspiratorial topics. Um, but from what I remember reading, the way the project ended, and correct me if I'm mistaken here, boys, but from what I recall reading, it actually had to do with the aforementioned beast or monster that was accidentally summoned. So, uh, there was a specific psychic that was actually the quote unquote guinea pig for most of the Montauk project that I think was mentioned earlier. Maybe he wasn't. His name is Duncan Cameron, and for a majority of these experiments, he was the one projecting his thoughts. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the Duncan Cameron is actually the brother, supposedly, of Ed Cameron, who, if you remember from me talking about the Philadelphia experiment, is the birth name of Al Bielek. So there's a connection there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But anyways,
So,
continue.
as these time travel experiments were refined and were progressing, um, Nichols and some of the other members on the team began to become concerned with the potential ramifications of what they were messing with. And they began to fear that if they continued to just carelessly go forward with these, that they could do some irrevocable damage to the fabric of space-time. So they surmised together that if they felt it was ever going too far, that they would whisper, I guess, a kind of a kill switch, like code phrase to Duncan while he was under hypnosis, and that phrase is "the time is now." So if they were to whisper "the time is now" to Duncan while he was under hypnosis, projecting things and opening rifts in space time, he would then, end it, shut it all down. They ended up trying this one day, and it ended up backfiring in a really terrible, horrific way. According to Nichols, when they whispered "the time is now" to Duncan Cameron, a hideous monster that was from somewhere within his subconscious manifested into physical reality and began destroying parts of the base, eating people. It was just this ravenous, horrific entity that was just destroying everything. And so, in a panic, Nichols and his men tried turning off the power to the control room, and the chapter in the book goes into a little bit more detail. But long story short, after cutting a series of wires, flipping a bunch of breakers and kill switches, they eventually got the equipment to finally turn off, and allegedly the beast like dissipated into the ether. And if I'm not mistaken, it was at that point that they were like, okay, that's a wrap. I think we've gone too far with this. Let's stop this. And so, according to him, if I remember correctly, the government then systematically memory holed everybody who was involved in the project and wrapped it up. Do I have that straight, gentlemen? Is there anything you wanted to add, either of you?
No, I could give you a basic description of the creature. Some people said it was between 9 and 30 feet tall. Preston Nichols claims that this discrepancy in height was because of the people who saw it were very frightened, and he says fright does strange things to people. So that kind of explains why they may have seen slightly different things. Is it really different if a 20 or 50-foot monster's running at you? It's a big ass monster, regardless.
Yeah, totally.
But yeah, he said that it would eat anything it could find, and it smashed everything in sight. So
Right.
just imagine this, between 9 and 30-foot thing just kind of smashing around in the base. Pretty scary stuff.
And also worth noting for our listeners, if they aren't already aware of this, but apparently the core concept of Stranger Things was based on the Montauk Project. And I haven't watched Stranger Things yet, but I'm familiar with it. And if I'm not mistaken, there are like interdimensional monster demon things in the show, right? And I'm guessing that this is probably how that ties in. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, and Stranger Things goes very much into like the psychic power, mind control aspect of things. Before it was actually titled Stranger Things, the guys who were working on the show was actually titled Montauk. So it's directly like they are directly taking their information from, I believe, Preston Nichols' series of books. And it's not just kind of a loose inspiration, and it's one that they very openly admit to being the basis for the show.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, if I'm not mistaken, that is after they cut all of the power, the beast allegedly vanished, and that was the end of the Montauk project. Now we just did a crash course, like flyby of the meat of it. There's so much in between the origins of the Philadelphia experiment and then like the end of the project. There's like a ton to talk about. I don't know if there's any individuals that either of you want to bring up and focus on, or any other like aspects of the experiments that you guys want to focus on. I'll leave the floor to either of you.
Yeah, I think you did a good job of
Thanks. That was a lot.
It is a lot. It is a lot. And like you were saying, I highly encourage anybody who's interested in this topic to go listen to some of the talks from people like Preston Nichols and Al Bielek, because it's really astounding the level of detail to which they describe these things. And they go deep into the underlying scientific concepts. They mention a lot of specific people. They really manage to make it sound very believable. Like they actually believe it. And actually experience these things. And like
Mm-hmm.
in particular, I would recommend people listen to the Art Bell episodes from Coast to Coast with both of these gentlemen. There's a lot in there.
Preston Nichols and who's the other gentleman?
And Al Bielek.
Al Bielek. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it would be impossible for us, even with months of research, much less 2 weeks, to cover everything. It's just an overwhelmingly large and detailed story between everyone. So yeah. I also just wanted to throw in there that Preston Nichols mentions that he is actually the one who went in with a torch to destroy the technology behind the Montauk chair that was allowing this beast to be conjured, and claims that you could still see the scorch marks on this device if you were to go back to the base.
That's right. And it just so happens that one of my co-hosts lives not too far from it, yes?
It's true. It's true. I am well within the effective radius of the Montauk chair myself.
Gotta find those burn marks, bruh.
I totally intend to go out there. I think that's a good point, is that the base, Camp Hero, as it is now known, is still there. And there are lots of videos online and stories of people who have gone and snuck into the base, explored around. Once again, I encourage listeners to go check some of this out. You can see some of the facilities. You can see the giant radio antennas that are still there. Preston claims that there are miles and miles of underground tunnels that run along the eastern edge of the Long Island Peninsula, where Montauk and the base are. These tunnels have not been found by anyone, but that's not to say that they're not there necessarily. There are plenty of ways that they could be prevented from being discovered or found out. But that is one of the claims that he makes. And a lot of people have gone back to try and see if there's any evidence of this. Some people say, and this is pretty verified, if you go into the base, you can see that it is trashed, and some of what's in the base is destroyed. People use this as evidence that, when a government or when the government or the military typically close down a base, they don't do so in such a manner where they leave a bunch of stuff there and it's kind of a wreck. People use that as evidence that this event with the monster did occur. Now, whether that is enough to convince anyone that that is the case, it's hard to say, because it's very likely that just through people urban exploring, vandals, kids, whatever, who are breaking into this thing, could easily cause that kind of havoc, in my opinion. But that is one thing that people say. Yeah, and then also, did either of you get into the Montauk boys and all this? Like, I guess this is we kind of mentioned this in that we talked about the psychics being recruited, but these allegedly were young men or boys who were either destitute typically or pulled from their families, and a lot of them have allegedly come forward in the revelation of this, and Preston had since been involved in trying to help them deprogram, I guess would be the right word, or help alleviate some of the lingering trauma or psychological, neurological issues that they still suffer because of their experiences at Montauk. Did either of you go into any of that?
The book, and I'm hoping this is what you're referring to. The book has a chapter that talks about how they were covertly recruiting children, teenagers, always white, blonde hair, blue-eyed. There was this Aryan thing going on, which ties into the whole Nazi financing aspect of it. But they, according to the book, would send these children into these time portals to certain periods of time. And in fact, there is one date in particular that was mentioned. I think it was 6037 AD.
That's correct.
They were like shuttling like all these white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed children to the year 6037 AD, for reasons unknown. If I'm not mistaken, Preston himself says he doesn't know what it was about that. Go ahead, Alex.
So I agree that they don't know exactly why they sent them to that year in particular, but they would send them to a specific area, and you'll see this on the cover of Preston Nichols' first book. I think it's called Chronicles in Time.
Yeah, it's Montauk Project Chronicles in Time.
Montauk Project Chronicles in Time, with the dark horse on the front cover. But he claimed that while training these boys, what they wanted to do was send them to somewhere that had a distinguishing characteristic. Think this big horse statue in the middle of a ruined town. That way, when the boys came back, they would ask them and say, "What did you see while you were there?" And it was kind of a training thing where they would say, if the boys were like, "Well, I saw, this big horse statue," they would know that. But one, the experiment was successful, and two, that these boys were paying attention when they were transported. So we're using that as kind of a training exercise, supposedly.
Okay. Yeah, I also read that they were sending children back to the First and Second World Wars, if I'm not mistaken. They had a focus on that. And lest I forget, as if we haven't covered enough territory already, apparently they were also sending them to Mars. Yes, the planet Mars. Apparently there is a secret colony of human beings on the planet Mars some point in the future, I guess. If I have this straight, I'm sorry if I get it mixed up. There's just so many things. But according to Nichols, there's some sort of pyramid-like structure on Mars that apparently has some sub-chamber that the people on Mars weren't able to access. So they were using these space-time portals. They used it to transport people underneath the pyramid on Mars. I feel silly saying this, but this is what the book said. And there was apparently, according to him, they were thinking there was some sort of secret alien technology underneath this pyramid-like structure on the surface of Mars. And so they would, they beamed themselves through one of those vortexes underneath the pyramid and maybe got some secret alien technology. But Preston himself says he wasn't fully aware of that aspect of the experiments because, according to him, as much as he did know, a lot of this was still very compartmentalized, need to know basis. So
I wanted to
that's
add
what he
something
said.
here too.
Yeah, go
So
ahead.
I'm not sure if it was Al Bielek or Preston Nichols. It was probably Nichols. But he claimed that a lot of these coordinates, so to speak, that they were sending these people to were actually a list given to us by the aliens. And we were also trying to figure out how to find our own coordinates. And Nichols claimed that every point in space-time has a specific defining, I think he used the term vibration or frequency. And
He uses
by
both those terms a lot.
right, by knowing that frequency, you are able to travel to that particular spot. One other thing I wanted to add too. You've mentioned they were sending people to Mars. Did any of you guys read about how they sent somebody back in time to try to clone Jesus? Did you guys come across
No.
this?
I heard a mention of this, but please
R-
elaborate if you
Yeah.
know the details.
So supposedly they wanted to clone Jesus, which I think is not a crazy thought to have. He would definitely be up there on the wanna clone list.
Yeah.
So they sent somebody back, and in order to, I guess, get blood from him or something like that, one of the psychics actually supposedly inhabited the body of Judas and betrayed Jesus and was able to get his blood through those means. But it seems like this theory, the Montauk Project really spans everything. We went from Mars to Jesus to Nazi gold to aliens to there's mentions of Aleister Crowley, but it really seems all encompassing. Like there
Yeah.
isn't
So
anything that it doesn't touch.
if I'm understanding what you're saying, because I actually didn't come across this part in my research, that's fascinating. Is basically the claim here that we have the Christian story because of the meddling in time, like the timeline we're living in now, and the story of the betrayal of Christ that we have now is a result of their meddling in time.
Well, I wouldn't say that, and obviously this is wild speculation on my part, but from what I could piece together from Nichols' story is that the person actually inhabited the body of Judas, and I believe just they were Judas, not that they betrayed Jesus on their own accord. I think I from my understanding is that happened, but this person was just in Judas's body while it happened. But you could extrapolate that maybe this person was in control of Judas. It's not 100% clear, but I don't think he claims that it's that consequential, this action, that it actually, that's the reason that Jesus was betrayed was because of what this psychic did. He just happened to be in Judas's body. So I see why you say that, and maybe it can be interpreted that way, but that wasn't quite the vibe that I got.
Okay. Okay. I kind of wanted to steer the conversation in forward, kind of like unless either of you wanted to add anything else about like the lore. I kind of wanted to. Did either of you want to add anything else about the lore? Because I really want to.
No,
I think
think
we
that
have
covers it.
burdened the listeners enough.
Okay.
Obviously,
Yeah.
this in detail is all available to go research on your own accord. We even if we wanted to, and like I said, even if we spent months doing heavy research, I still don't think we would be able to present you with a comprehensive picture of how far this goes
Mhm.
in a series of podcasts, much less one episode. So I think this is good for a basic overview, and if you want to learn more, please look into it. There's plenty to fill your time. But yeah, I think we should move forward.
Yeah. What I wanted to say is I found this topic simultaneously fascinating and frustrating. Fascinating on just like on a whimsical, fantastical level, just because it's so creative in its imaginativeness. But frustrating if I was even going to try to attempt to take it seriously, because there's so much. And so, what is it? It was it Carl Sagan who said extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So, Preston Nichols and company, they all insisted, and I'm pretty sure Nichols to his dying day insisted that everything he was touting here was the truth. Like, these things actually literally happened. This isn't just like a sci-fi story. But what's so frustrating is from my research, the complete and utter lack of any tangible evidence to any of these things. And then, like, he just layers one absurd, fantastical story on top of another at lightning speed. So, like, it's like, slow down. Like, we haven't even demonstrated that we can go to Mars, or like, you can't demonstrate that we can even control the weather. There's so many things that we need to like prove before we can just. He just keeps going like a full speed train down a mountain, saying all this shit. And the thing that I found frustrating was like, man, like, one of the things I love about a good conspiracy, is when there's like something like MK Ultra, which I'm sure we'll have in the future on a future episode. Like, there's a lot to chew on there, but there's actual evidence. There's tangible evidence. There's government documents. It's a proven fact. Something like this, there's no actual evidence at all that I'm aware of, other than hearsay from several people. But just the fact that because it's so all encompassing with all these like ridiculous stories, it's just like I feel like I'm reading like I said, like a sci-fi book instead of like something that could actually happen in reality.
Right. I like, so I was thinking about this a lot, right? Because yeah, this kind of claim, has, if you go on and on like this, there are some ways that you can verify it. Pardon me. The first thing I thought of is, why can't we recreate, if Preston Nichols claims to, and he has diagrams of the Montauk chair, like intricate diagrams with specific components and wiring and things like that. If he has that kind of information and is freely putting it out there, why is it, do you guys think, that no one has tried to recreate these things?
So I want to make a comment about his specific diagrams. So I've done like a little bit of radio stuff in the past, and if you look at these diagrams, to like a layperson, they may seem complex, but they're very, very basic. I wouldn't even say that they are nearly complete enough to describe just an even normal consumer radio at the time of this experimentation happening. So these diagrams don't really offer much. They're incredibly basic. They show at the most a rudimentary understanding of radio technology. So I do want to caution anybody from looking at these diagrams and thinking like, oh, this is the real deal. Like, this is why is nobody recreating this? So I think that's part of the answer. I think really, I think really the answer is because this isn't super substantiated. A lot of times, and this will be a whole nother podcast, but when we talk about like MK Ultra or these other strange, fringe government experiments, there's a lot more evidence, I guess you would call it here, where we actually see the government make a comment. And even if it's not a comment just coming clearly out and saying, hey, we did this thing, it's like there's usually at least enough of a thread there for people to pull at. And when this is just, one, I don't want to say just one guy's, but like mainly one or two guys' accounts, alongside these rudimentary, block diagrams of components and circuits. I just don't feel like there's a big idea here, but there's not really a good basis of a jumping off point to tackle the problem with technology.
I mean, I do see what you're saying, but in listening to Preston, I mean, he gives specific amperages, specific frequencies, even specific like pulse frequencies. He goes very deep into like, some of the stuff that you don't really need to know the underlying technology so much as you just need to be able to recreate some of these like, specific radio band frequencies at these specific pulses. And I'm just curious as to why, even at that level, surely now we would be able to just use the numbers that he's spitting out and attempt to see if anything happens, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that he was formally educated in engineering, right? I had the impression when reading the book that there are several passages in the book that go into some degree of detail about how these mechanisms were constructed and what it was like. I was under the impression it could be one of two things. Like, as a layman who doesn't know anything about electronics engineering, it could just as easily be like engineering babble as it could be something legitimate, right? Mm-hmm. My impression from reading him is that like again, I don't know, because when he starts like rambling on about oscillators and transmitters and amplifiers and crystal coils and things like that, like, I don't know. I don't profess to know. It's not my area of expertise. But I get the impression that he's someone who has some degree of working knowledge about these things, but is just shitting it out, essentially, to put it in a crass way.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but the thing that gets me is like, and also he's not the only one that talks about some of the specifics of the technology. Al Bielek also goes into the design of what allowed the Eldridge to be transported and talks about some sort of creation of some sort of toroidal electromagnetic, like, I don't know if you would describe it as a dome or encasement created by this machine that's attached to some sort of antenna. And nowadays, it seems like the stakes, right? If you could unlock this technology, let's take them at face value and, just assume that they're saying the truth. If you could even risk like a failure, surely someone like Elon Musk or someone who has the ability to try some of this out, it seems like it would be worth the risk of failure. You know what I mean? The ability to transport yourself instantaneously from one position to the other, the ability to manipulate time. I was just curious as to why some of this hasn't been attempted, and I wonder if that's just because there are so many holes in the underlying science. But do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that you're correct. It probably is just because there are so many holes in the science, and I think Chops is correct too. It does come across very kind of techno babbly,
Mhm.
but just to kind of to perform a thought experiment here. So say somebody was successful in recreating these technologies. Why do you think that they would come to the public this time? Obviously, these are very advantageous things to have, right? Stealth technology, time travel, all of these different things. Why would that be something that the public would become privy to? If somebody actually was able to demonstrate these, don't you think that the government would potentially come in and say, yep, we're putting the kibosh to this and it's ours now? I mean,
Right. The thing is, and this is another thing I was going to bring up that was one of my doubts about this, is that I feel like if you have this technology, how can you conceal it? I mean, the just like from the physical implications, like of what's actually happening, I feel like you would pick up power surges, you would see evidence of this stuff going on, and if someone possesses this power, and this is like one of the biggest things that makes me question the validity of this. If the government has this power, why are they not in control of everything? They are effectively God, right? The ability to manipulate space and time on such a fundamental level, to traverse time at whim. This is the power of a god. And why I just don't see a reality in which anybody who possesses this, much less the US government military apparatus, that we would just, our life would be as normal as it is. You know? Like, why are there, why are there still other governments? One of the things that Al Bielek mentions is that one of the reasons that this hasn't been, that there's no like government trail, and some of the government officials who he claims to have been involved haven't said anything, is that it actually transcends the US government and is controlled by some sort of conspiratorial new world order. And
as if we didn't have enough conspiracies in this topic.
I know, it just goes on and on. But I think the biggest thing is that I just don't see this being able to stay under the radar for so long. How have we not, how are we not, if humans had the ability, even if it was a small group of people, had the ability to manipulate time like this, I just imagine that surely we would be experiencing some sort of time distortion or effect in our reality.
The counter to this is you also have to keep in mind that they allegedly possess the power to control the thoughts, emotions, and actions of human beings. And they have the power to memory hole people. And if they fuck up something and it gets out, I suppose they could just hop into their time portal and fix it. As silly as it sounds, but it's one of the first things that popped into my head. It's like, well, I guess if you're a master over time, you can fix any of your problems by, if time's no longer linear for you and you can go back to any point and manipulate it, then
right.
And if you can brainwash people and control what they say and think and do, well,
right. The thing about that is, it makes me go, well, why even give it any thought at this point? Because it would be something so far out of our ability to control or comprehend it or influence it at all. We're essentially, every human would be at the mercy of this force that is just way bigger than us.
Yeah, 100%.
And if it's not getting involved in what we experience as our day-to-day lives, what's the point of even giving a shit about it, right? It's bigger than you. You can't stop it. if you experience it, they're controlling your ability to recall it or realize that you're experiencing it. So let it be, right? How can
Yeah.
you expect to break out of it? One thing I did hear Preston say is that with the memory manipulation, that it's quite easy to actually break free of it. And he says that it's a pure matter of will. You can actually, if you're aware that it's happening and you focus on noticing it, he says that you can actually experience this sensation of doing things that are out of your normal tendency, or something that noticing that you're doing something that you did not intend to do. And that if you are aware that something is going on through sheer power of like focus and will, you can actually stop it and also come to remember the things that you were forced to forget. And if that's the case, then surely we would be able to perceive it going on, even us right now, because we would be like, huh. Like, I mean, I've given it the, right? Like, just because I have given it the whole, like, let me just sit here and see. If I try and, like, focus on moving my consciousness above the level where it can be manipulated, can I find something? And the answer is no, I cannot.
Maybe this is getting too specific here, but Preston Nichols, I know he's claimed this. I just watched the interview earlier today. He claimed that the mind control aspect of the project was not able to just like blanket mind control everyone or the population, that it was a very targeted thing, that they were never able to actually get it to work where they could control groups of people. It was only able to ever control a single person. So I just kind of
If
wanted
I
to add that.
if I remember
But
in the
that
book,
it's been 40 years since then.
if I remember in
just
the book, he was able to they were able to make like the crime rates go up in parts of New York by focusing the beam in certain directions. So it seems like on some level they had like maybe they were, I don't recall offhand. There was just so much information being thrown at me in this book, but I don't recall offhand if they were able to get any specific thought patterns into masses of people. But it seemed like I do distinctly remember, for one thing, like when they would play certain pulses, electromagnetic waves at certain amplitudes, at certain pulses at certain times on the base, it would affect the general disposition of everyone there.
Okay, so
and
so we can either take this as you and I are remembering things differently, or is this, set of different information from the same source indicative of him not having his story straight?
Mm,
I
you know,
think if I had to guess, it's probably the latter. Um, but
yeah.
I also want to point out that it's been 40 years since these claimed events, and if we are just assuming that this is true, that's a lot of time to develop this technology. Not to mention the fact that if you have control of time, you can work on uh you can go forward in time, you can borrow from future technology. um you can progress this a lot quicker. And we all know Moore's law, right? That technology grows at an exponential rate, and something like this surely would be a part of that, where if you have this understanding and you get a smart person on it thinking about it, developing technology, developing ways to hone it and perfect it, it's not inconceivable that you could reach that level of control. And I mean, you can follow the thought out as far as like we could very well be living in a simulated reality purely on the behest of this whoever is controlling this technology.
Yeah,
They
and
could be controlling the very fabric of what we experience as reality at this point.
I think we should absolutely do an episode just focusing on time travel. There's some accounts with specific individuals that I think are pretty interesting. But one of my
Mhm.
gripes with time travel in general, and maybe this is getting too general, is I feel like if time travel existed, it would have always existed, if that makes sense. Because if you can go into the future and bring it back, wouldn't you
Mhm.
just bring it back to the earliest time that you could time travel to? And then eventually it would just propagate throughout reality, and it would have time travel either doesn't exist at all or it's always existed, is kind of how I
Right.
Right.
see the thought.
There
Right.
are a lot of paradoxes here and things that are hard to wrap your head around. You think like if they had the ability to reliably travel through time in the 80s, the people in the 6000s are surely coming back and influencing our time and probably also influencing the people who are coming up with this technology in our time, and what's preventing them from going back. Like you said, it's just like it's so hard to believe in this concept because of just the mess it makes of a linear timeline and reality. It's hard to believe that we would perceive our time as it is, which I think we all agree is somewhat normal from a like day-to-day human experience level. It's hard to believe that would be going on without something, some strange effect being able to be perceived by the average human.
Like the Fruit of the Loom
Um,
logo changing or the Berenstein Bears. I mean, just
Oh
saying.
no.
I mean, yeah, right. Like yeah, there's some weird stuff, but this is like time and space altering levels of weird. Um,
Yeah, like why
like
would there
you
be
said,
war anymore? Like, it's these
yeah,
fundamental
and
things.
another thing I thought about this that I was like, why? This is like a big red flag to me about the validity is like Preston Nichols is saying if this technology that he's claiming is the technology and he did work on it and he was a part of this, he's put out enough that if a foreign government thought there was any validity to this, surely they are trying to use this information to work in this area themselves. And you would imagine that there's going to be conflict because unless this power that this organization or government or the US has is like so omnipotent and powerful that they can just prevent anybody from even, you know, working on any of this, surely there's going to be conflict between people who want who want power and who are interested in power dynamics. You'd have other countries like working on this same kind of technology.
Didn't Preston claim that it took some type of exotic material in order to make all of this work properly? So you could say that the scarcity of that material. I think he said that. Maybe I'm
Hmm.
not sure if you guys came across that. Maybe
Well, I
that's
know you were talking about orgone energy. I don't know
right.
if that's what you're
I'm not.
referring
That might.
to.
I'm not sure what specifically he was talking about, but that would be
Mm.
one of the ways you could kind of refute that. Like, if it's the same reason that every country on Earth doesn't have nuclear weapons, right? It's hard to refine uranium,
Right.
somewhat. So,
I don't recall coming across that.
mhm.
But with the amount of stuff that he
Yeah,
said, I wouldn't be surprised if that was something that was mentioned.
that's another
And if
problem.
that's the case, I guess that's a counterpoint, but
Yeah, that's another problem I have with the story. Is so at this point, Preston Nichols and Peter Moon have put out, I want to say, 4 or 5 different books specifically about the Montauk Project. Um, and it seems like every time a new book comes out, there's some new big revelation tying it to some popular conspiracy theory. Like
Mhm.
it started out as crazy as it is, but when you really dig, like the Montauk Project just itself seems pretty simple when you actually look at everything else this guy has claimed. He claims that like Montauk was a sacred spot, and the Montonkan, like Indian, Native American Indian, whatever you want to call them, people, um, knew that it was a sacred place, and there's pyramids under the ground there. And I think this came out in his later books, and it's like,
Oh wow.
you can chalk it up to like repressed memories resurfacing. Like that's a very convenient answer to why I don't have all the answers right away. But it just doesn't feel right. It just it feels like, hey, this meal's getting a little bland. Let's throw some more spice on it real quick. Let's sell a couple more books. I hate to say it, but I just get that feeling about it.
Yeah, I definitely
Yep.
know what you mean. I agree. I do like to, I think we should try and give it the benefit of the doubt here. There are just so many ways. Like, for example, another thing my brain jumped to is thinking about something like in the Philadelphia experiment, the Eldridge being transported. He also mentions that, or Al Bielek mentions that, there is an actual like circle of matter and space-time that is transported, including some of the water that the ship was in.
Mhm.
And my thought was, if that happened, okay, so we have all of a sudden, and this could be, see, this is the problem with these kinds of theories. There's always well, I see your point, but it works like this. There's always a convenient excuse, but
Are you gonna say there's gonna be a vacuum there,
yeah,
like where
exactly.
yeah,
Right? Like where
mhm.
if matter, if a huge mass such as a battleship and like probably tons of water is instantly gone from that physical space, you all of a sudden have a vacuum, and what happens to everything around it? It collapses on that vacuum. And
Mhm.
I just imagine that would be something that was very noticeable. It would surely cause some sort of energy release.
Yeah, I'd imagine like
And
almost like a nuclear explosion or something, right? Like
right,
or
I was
something, right? Some sort of crazy collapsing in on itself.
Well, isn't a
right.
vacuum bomb like an actual thing?
Is it?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't be
I
surprised.
think so.
I
Huh.
remember watching a video on what happens when they detonate a deep sea nuclear test. And because of the energy release from the initial reaction, um, it essentially pushes all matter in that space outwards and creates a vacuum. And what happens is this, what we are talking about happening with the Eldridge and the space that's missing there, is the matter rushes and collapses back in to fill that vacuum and releases another shockwave and a ton of energy. And this would have huge consequences on the immediate area. You'd have like, I just can't imagine that it would just be something that could be happening in a Philadelphia harbor and no one, there's no evidence. Like there's no
Yeah.
wide reports.
Yeah.
It just
Yeah.
doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, since it would completely defy the laws of physics as we know it, I mean, one could at least imagine that it could theoretically have some detrimental effect on the entirety of reality. You know what I
Right.
mean? Not right. It could like the ramifications. You could imagine it being huge, right? And that's something I hadn't really considered. But that's a great point to bring up. That does Nichols address this at all, or
I
does
mean,
he?
I didn't hear Al Bielek address this. I didn't hear Nichols address this. Um, I did hear Bielek saying that our classical understanding of physics is wrong, and that the Einstein's unified field theory, which kind of integrates the theories of electromagnetism and space-time gravity as Einstein interpreted it together, is a wrong understanding of how reality actually works, which
Well,
is
there's our
a huge
explanation, I
claim.
guess.
It's a yeah, see, that's the thing I'm saying, is like there's always something that they can say, well this, well this, well this. And the thing is, how many times can you say that before you run into something that would just be so easy to prove, right?
The other thing is
Like,
too, there's never been like a paper trail of any type. Like Chops and I were talking about this the other night. Like even a receipt of some like radio equipment bought to to the Camp Hero. You know,
Mhm.
like just
Yeah,
anything.
something
Just give
banal
me
and mundane.
anything.
Right. The thing that I've heard that is the closest to this, I think, is I'm sure you guys came across this, the food that was being delivered to the base post decommission, and it was something like $80,000 a month or a week. I can't. It was some extraordinary amount of money,
I didn't come
and
across this one.
yeah. So there were, and this is, I believe, this is like actually verifiable. There is an actual real paper trail for this. I could be
Okay.
wrong, but I'm pretty sure that that's the case. Um, so that's one weird thing, but like it's not enough. It is not nearly enough
Right.
to justify the claims that are being made here.
Well, Alex, you did send me. I'm trying to find right now a link. The best thing we could find was right. Didn't the Navy publish something where they just flatly deny the Philadelphia experiment ever happening?
Yeah, it actually came
in the-
from the Department of the Navy, and yeah, they say something to the effect of like, a lot of people have mentioned this. It's not something that ever happened. Which I think it is worth like looking into anytime the government specifically denies a claim. Like, I mean, you would almost think just saying nothing would be better, but when you start to actually deny something specifically, it almost casts more of an air of doubt on it. It's like, okay, of course they don't want us to know. Like,
Yeah.
maybe it
Right.
actually
Right.
did
Right.
happen. So
Right.
it's interesting that they felt the need to comment on it at all.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I actually have that pulled up right here. And yeah, they mention the logs of travel and that the Eldridge was not even in Philadelphia at the time.
It was in New York.
Did they say that?
No,
I
I'm
thought
kidding.
they said it was
It was a joke.
okay. Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah, I think it was like in Casablanca or something, or I don't remember. It wasn't there, according to them.
Mhm.
And they also say that this is verified. There was an operation to attempt at camouflaging of these ships. However, it was not like an invisibility camouflaging. It was a degaussing of the hulls of these ships to make them magnetically invisible. So they actually were experimenting with running these high amperage wires along the hulls of battleships and warships during that time to hide I think it counteracts the charge of the hull
Like
and makes
grounds
them
it or something.
something like that. Yeah, I'm not sure how the
Okay.
science works, but it would essentially make them invisible to mines and radar or sonar.
Right. Right.
And this makes a lot of sense. Like
yeah,
this
exactly.
makes a lot of sense.
Right. This
Mhm.
is grounded in classical physics and is something that's very plausible and is verified. They said that they were doing it and they did do it. There's evidence of that. And they were saying that I've heard people say that that's one of the things that people latched onto is they misunderstood this when it came out or when there are inevitable rumors around it or people talk. And it got confounded or picked up by people who were inclined to run with it and extrapolated that it was like they were actually working on making them invisible. And another thing they say is Project Rainbow is a confoundation of people of another operation, which was under the name Rainbow, which was a strategic war thing related to the theaters in Europe during World War II and had no relation to any sort of weird science or anything like that. So there are some bits of reality that are not tied to this, but it's plausible to believe that someone who is more inclined to uh run away with their imagination could hear some of the snippets of these things and kind of make this story, or make some jumps in their interpretation of what is actually going on.
Right. I think the real interesting thing here, for me at least, is the fact that you have multiple people claiming similar or nearly the same stories. Like, we're mentioning Cameron and Nichols and Bielik, and I believe that there's even some others that maybe aren't quite as prolific as those three. But just, you have to wonder, are they colluding somehow to create this story? I mean, it does seem to just add a little bit of credibility to it. Like if one person said something crazy, it's easy to kind of write them off, right? But when you have a group of people, it starts to become a bit more credible, at least in my eyes.
Yeah, I
Mm.
I totally know what you're saying, and I do agree on some level. But for me, this is kind of an Occam's razor situation where my mind jumps to, well, people are easily influenced. There's a lot of people who, will hear things like this and either see the potential benefits to them in running with the story, ipso facto books, deals, talks, spotlight. There's a whole load of motivations that could potentially cause people to glom on to one person who might, actually believe this, either because of, there's a ton of plausible reasons that aren't that this actually happened. I just want to point out that this was in the wake of these stories are coming out in the wake of the 60s, and we all know what happened in the 60s. The psychedelic revolution, the counterculture movement, a lot of acid was going around. And a lot of this sounds like a lot of things that I hear when I am reading or listening to things about that era. Um, People who have, you know, run in circles that are heavily influenced by the psychedelic state. And I'm not saying that that's what's going on. I'm just saying that that's one plausible explanation if we're going to be super like cynical and skeptical about it. Um I also think that, you know, it could be someone who is mentally ill and then other people are glomming on. I also think that uh we kind of talked about this, Alex, a little bit with the fact that I had this theory, and we kind of talked about this theory of the physiology of the brain. Um, so for those who are not as familiar with like psychedelic culture, a lot of people who uh take DMT, dimethyltryptamine, have these experiences with very similar themes, where they encounter beings that of the same type, even though they're across the country or across the world or from a different time or whatever. And, we were talking about why that may be. And I we talked about the possibility that either subconsciously people are hearing one thing and then it's ingrained into them, and then when they have an experience like that, it manifests itself because it's buried in their memory. Another theory that I had was that maybe it has something to do with people's brains physiologically being structured in a similar way. We know so little about how memory works and how the brain works on like a microscopic level. It's just such a complex system. And I was thinking it's plausible that people's neurophysiology could be similar enough to the point where if you were to ingest a certain substance and shared a similar physiology to another person, it could affect the brain in such a way that it would elicit a response in a very specific part of the brain and could cause this sort of like reoccurring, seemingly eerily consistent hallucination across multiple people. And it could very well be that there is something like that going on with things like this. And this wouldn't just be uh contained to this specific conspiracy, but a lot of conspiracies potentially, where people who share certain similar physiological makeups in terms of their brains being subjected to similar things in their life, either, it could be things like food contaminants or mental illness or other things that cause these sort of similar delusions. And I know that's like, this whole rant is as much of a stretch in terms of me us coming up with these ideas as it is that they are coming up with their ideas. But it seems to me that this kind of thing is a lot more likely to cause similar thoughts across groups of people than it is that some of this larger than life stuff actually happened.
And I do want to say, like, your description of why it's potentially happening is far out, and you do recognize that. Like, it's making a lot of assumptions. I think that's
course.
what you're trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
But to add a little bit of credence and credibility to it, I mean, you look at like people with schizophrenia or these other mental illnesses, a lot of them are concerned about mind control specifically, like mind control and mental illness. And for whatever reasons, I'm not going to speculate on why that is, but that is a very common theme that you see, right? You look at like gang stalking, all these things, you see that is a pattern of thought that mental illness definitely seems to create this specific thought process of, hey, I'm being mind controlled. So I don't, as far out as it is and as many assumptions as it takes, there is, you could kind of see how it could lead to some of these thoughts, at least.
Sure. And then like he said, the power of suggestibility. If a group of these people get together and they just like they confirmation bias each other's what they thought their experiences were.
Mm-hmm.
It could certainly account for it. But my take is that, to put it bluntly, Nichols is a grifter. I think he's a grifter. Maybe it's a combination. Maybe he is partially mentally ill. Maybe he is suffering from some sort of psychological issues. But a lot of this seems so concerted. So, like, think of all the marketing, all the books, all the talks. I'm sure when he was alive, he probably went on tours talking about stuff. I would have to verify that, of course. But still, I mean, it still stands that I have no doubt that he made some money off of this. He and Al Bielek, I'm sure they made some money.
Right. And it doesn't even have to be monetarily motivated. Plenty of people are willing to do or come up with things purely on the basis of wanting to just make life interesting or be in the spotlight.
Oh, dude, attention. Yeah. Attention is
right.
like one of the most valuable things, right?
Have you guys heard the story of Luca Magnotta, who was a serial killer, I believe from Canada, who committed all these heinous murders and manipulated people purely because he wanted to be famous?
Yeah.
No. Wow. I don't know this one.
It's an interesting story. It's worth looking up. It's very disturbing, but there's no real motivation other than they just wanted to be in the spotlight. They wanted fame, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths, many murders. So, people will do a lot for, it doesn't even have to be something that's monetarily motivated.
And if that was his goal, it worked, right? I mean, look, they spawned a television series after it. He went on Art Bell's show. He published all his books, and here we are, years after his death, talking about it.
And I want to mention one other thing, and maybe Brandon could extrapolate on this because I know that you mentioned it to me when we were talking the other day. And I don't want to use this as a judgment of Nichols' character, but you know what I'm gonna say already. As weird as this is to say, it seems as the story grew bigger, and towards maybe the later parts of his life, there seemed to be somewhat of a sexual component to this. He Preston was offering like kind of, I think Brandon called it like deprogramming sessions, or I don't know if it's like past life regression or whatever it would be. But during these sessions, he would take people in who believed that they were part of the Montauk Project or another mind control experiment, and he would, I guess, do things. And I say do things because I don't know what's there, not because I'm trying to be politically correct here. Um, do things to their naked bodies, in order to deprogram them. During the documentary that I watched, I think it was called the Montauk Chronicles, there was a woman claiming that he would never do these type of procedures with her, and that he would only like to do them with other men. So it seemed they're starting to point at maybe some type of sexual thing. And I'm not saying that that's why this story is created, because in order to create this story, to get to that end goal would be incredible, like unfathomable. But
Yeah.
to have it used and twisted in that way, I think adds another interesting yet unfortunate potentially layer to the story. Is this kind of what you were reading, Brandon, about that particularly?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the way I heard it told was that he claimed that the way that these deprogramming or whatever sessions would go is that the subject had to be in a state of sexual excitement, and that he would take them away in that state. Whatever happened would happen. And then I heard one person reported that he would come out sweating and huffing, and you can only imagine.
Okay, so this is more explicit than I thought. Okay. That's
Yeah.
why
It seemed like it was, at least from the account that I had heard. It was some documentary I watched on YouTube. I forget what it was exactly. But yeah, it seems like from this account, it was very much a direct sexual thing going on. And like you said, it's not something that, you can totally discredit any of what he's saying about the Montauk Project about, but it is definitely something to consider when you're reflecting on his character as a person and his potential motivations, and the fact that, if it would be taking advantage, right, of people, and that in of itself is enough to question him on his motives for this kind of thing. At least a little bit. It's worth considering.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. Overall, I would say my thoughts on this one are kind of in alignment with what you guys have said. I really find it hard to believe that there is nothing. I think the claims are just too big. They make too big claims. These things are like, it's either, completely bullshit, or, like we talked about earlier, that this is true, and that those who have this technology at their disposal are essentially acting as gods and are controlling the very way we experience our reality. And at that point, what can we do? How can we, I find it hard to understand how it makes a difference to us at that point, because we're completely at the whim of this thing that's far bigger and far more powerful than us. It would be like trying to understand the nature of God. It's like, it's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary, and I agree with what both of you are saying as well. I do want to tack on, do I think that the government would be interested in these technologies purported here? Absolutely. Do I think that they've looked into how to do these things that Preston Nichols is claiming are possible? I do. Do I think Preston Nichols is actually blowing the whistle on something that actually happened? I do not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I
well
would agree
said.
wholeheartedly. Yep.
Yeah, I completely
And
agree as well.
so yeah, I had one more thing to say. Actually, what you just said, Alex, reminded me. Like, I thought, why are there so many people who are willing to believe this or take this at face value, considering how crazy it sounds? And like, it's not that far off from some of the stuff that's actually occurred. You know, like we talked about MK Ultra, that's verified, that really happened. You know, the Tuskegee experiment, if you guys know about that one, where the government inflicted these black communities in the South with syphilis just to see what would happen and didn't treat them. You know, like it is very, it's provable that the government has been involved in, is probably still involved in, and will probably still find their way to be involved in things of a conspiratorial and dark nature. And I think considering those things, it's always worthwhile to have these kinds of discussions and to consider these claims, despite how wild they may seem, with a real interrogative eye, and to try and approach these things with a sense of rationality, but also the open-mindedness to consider the fact that anything is possible. And we, you know, en masse, communities have been lied to and deceived, and there will be other things like this. So, yeah, we should keep having these discussions about this type of stuff. Even though people like Preston Nichols sound like batshit crazy, there's a precedent for similar things.
I mean, yeah. I'm sure that before, like, the MK Ultra documents came out, I'm sure there were people who claimed that they were victims of that and were scoffed at. I have no doubt.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Plus, it's great fun to dig into this.
It is. I wanted to say this earlier. Like, this is a hell of a story. It's got everything from flashbacks, you know, like Jason Bourne, like Who Am I, to freaking time travel, man, to aliens, to Aleister Crowley, to Nazis. I mean, you got to give the guy, if you're not going to say that he is actually telling the truth, the guy's got a hell of an imagination on him. And you know, as we said, it spawned into Stranger Things. And I would imagine that there's even other pieces of art out there in literature that have just kind of spun off of this thing. It's a hell of a story. It's worth going down the rabbit hole every time on this one. It's just so damn entertaining. And it's just,
there's a movie about the Philadelphia experiment.
I need to watch it.
The Philadelphia experiment.
Yes,
yeah, me too.
Exactly. But I don't think I could write a story that would be this interesting. I don't think a lot of us could. It's just so damn interesting.
Right.
Now, having said that, and this is personal opinion, I found the book to be well, not good. but the lore and the mythos surrounding this is very entertaining and enjoyable. The book itself, I think, was actually very poorly written, and I'm glad it was short because it was a bit of a slog at points. But again, like the overarching themes of it are very entertaining, and watching videos and falling down rabbit holes reading about it is a lot of fun.
Can you verify something for me real quick, Chops? I heard that in the book there is a foreword or a preface where Preston basically says, this is true, but you can also read it like it's a science fiction story.
Yes.
Did you is that in that book that you have?
He does say this. Hang on. Let me see if I can find it real quick. I actually have it up on my computer right now. I do remember reading. It's weird. It's like he gives himself an out. He gives he like let me see if I can find it. But yes, he does say something that amounts to that. Here we go. It's loading. See if we can... Okay, so this work is being presented as nonfiction as it contains no falsehoods to the best knowledge of the authors. However, it can also be read as pure science fiction if that is more suitable to the reader. Whatever that means. It's like, it's completely true, but also it could be completely false. What a paradox.
Right. I mean, maybe he was putting it in there because he was scared of like that other guy. Did we talk about this? The author who
Peter
who I
Moon?
think not Peter Moon. What was his name? Sorry, bear with me. Morris Jessup. Did we talk about Morris Jessup at all?
We had
This is a
mentioned
name
him,
I
and
did
that
not
was
come
kind of where
across
the
him.
first mentions of the Philadelphia experiment or the Montauk project came from. But other than
Yeah,
that, we didn't.
I think it was the Philadelphia experiment. But he wrote this book in 1955 called The Case for the UFO. And what ended up happening is kind of strange. The book somehow got sent to the military with handwritten annotations. And apparently it was concerning enough to them that they actually visited him, the Office of Naval Research, the ONR, which is like, I guess, an investigative branch of the Navy, actually came to visit this guy to question him and like see what was up with this book. And further down the line in 1959, he died in somewhat strange circumstances. He was found in his car in an apparent suicide. But I just thought it was, it is interesting that the government and the Navy are looking into this guy and visiting his house, and then he ends up dead 4 years later. Maybe Preston was scared of something similar, so he put that in.
Oh wow! So Jessup here sound not to get too far off the beaten path here, but I do want to say just the brief Wikipedia article here that Jessup claimed that linked ancient monuments could have been prehistoric super science. So it's giving like Graham Hancock to some extent, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Interesting.
it's it's just one of the many facets of this whole thing, and
Mhm.
it,
Which is in the same book, by the way, The Case for the UFO. He's this is where he mentions that. Yeah, the Philadelphia experiment.
Yeah, I think the book just goes over a bunch of, out there kind of things that he believed happened, and then
Like disconnected things.
right,
I'm
and then
assuming.
uses that as a case for why UFOs could be probable. Like if all these other things are probable, then aliens are probable. I think it may be worth grabbing a copy of that book and checking it out. It seems to be interesting and pretty early in the kind of UFO sphere. So
Yeah, I mean,
we might end up finding some stuff that we will discuss in later episodes.
absolutely,
definitely. Huh.
But yeah, final thoughts, guys, or anything else to add?
No, I just, as you did earlier, I would encourage people to check out interviews with Preston Nichols and Al Bielek. Super interesting stuff. We could have kept going for hours, and as Brandon said, it would take months or more to really get a solid grip on something that is spanning both space and time like this subject. But yeah, I hope that this conversation, helped all the listeners out there, form some opinions, potentially, stoke the fire and make you a little more interested in these kind of topics, and this one in particular. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you all very much. This has been another episode of Mystery School Dropouts. We will hopefully talk to you all soon, and we hope that you enjoyed what we had to say and will continue to listen to us in the future. For now, good night.
Adieu.